Okay, let me just share a thought. When my kids were growing up, we had a favorite book that they liked. And I don't know if you like it. It's called Shel Silverstein, Where the Sidewalk Ends. And one of my favorite poems is called No Difference. And I think it's appropriate here. It goes, small as a peanut, big as a giant. We're all the same size when you turn out the light. Rich as a sultan, poor as a mite. We're all worth the same when you turn off the light. Red, black, or orange, yellow, or white. We all look the same when you turn off the light. So maybe the way to make everything right is for God just to reach out and turn off the light. You know, in the end, it really doesn't matter what we look like, what we are, what we have, what we do. We're all children of God. And I think if we can learn to see each other as Heavenly Father sees us, we'll all do so much better. Okay. Today we start the investment side. This is probably one of my favorite parts of the class. So let's talk a lot about what's required for your personal financial plan. And actually what we're doing is we're going to put together an investment plan. My goal over the next 5 class periods is when you walk out of this class in 5 class periods, you will know what your asset allocation is. You will have your investment plan. You will know where your first dollar of that 20% that you're saving, everything, once you get out of school, where that first dollar is going. You'll know which funds you're going to invest in. You'll know all of these things. Not that you're going to know everything about investing, but you're going to know the important parts. And you'll feel comfortable so you can build a portfolio. Looking for the remote. Anyway. Someone's hidden the remote. Okay. Well, it looks like we won't use it. So here's what's required for your personal financial plan. What it requires is, first of all, I need you to go in Learning Tool 5A, and I'd like you to copy that over. Now, your investment plan is really a pretty detailed plan. It's called, in finance terms, it's called an investment policy statement. And so what we need you to do is copy that over, and then you're going to add information. You're going to add information on you, your position, your age, and we're going to answer the questions. What are your risk and return guidelines? What are your objectives? What are your investment guidelines and constraints? What is your investment policy? When will you evaluate, modify, and communicate results? And it includes your current investments and allocations. Second part is here, your action plan. What are your proposed investments and allocations? And so actually here what we'll do is you'll be actually picking which mutual funds that you want to invest in. You'll include copies from any financial source. Most of us will use Morningstar there, which we'll show you how to do in class. You'll have a minimum of four financial assets, and these will include your emergency fund, any core financial assets, any diversification assets, any opportunity assets. And you'll also include Teaching Tool 27, Expected Return Simulation, and Teaching Tool 13, your investment process. Now, this section is a pretty detailed section. And because of that, what I've done is I've given you assignments for today. So before you invest, like today after class, I'd like you to go copy Teaching Tool 5A. Copy it and make it yours. Number 2, I'd like you to add your information. And there's a little introduction for each of those sections. I'd like you to add that. Put in your age, if you're married, your spouse, your age of your spouse, things like that. I'd like you to take Teaching Tool 16, a risk tolerance test. We'll actually do that today in class. But what we want you to do is figure out what kind of an investor are you? Are you very conservative? Are you conservative? Are you moderate? Are you aggressive or very aggressive? Because your allocations will change based on what kind of investor you are. If you're married, I encourage you to have your spouse take that test as well. And you may find that one of you is very aggressive and the other is very conservative. That's kind of the way my wife and I are. And over time, we've kind of come to a midpoint. So I'm very aggressive, she's very conservative, and so we're basically moderate the way we work. And then what we want you to do is develop your preliminary asset allocation targets. What weight you'd have in stocks, bonds, and cash in your portfolio before retirement and after retirement. Okay, so that's what we want to do on the section on before you invest. Section on bond basics here. I'd like you to open up Learning Tool 23, Return Simulation for Asset Classes. I'd like you to look at the amount of volatility of bonds compared to other asset classes. Number 2, I'd like you to open up Learning Tool 27 and go to the tab titled Returns and Risk and just kind of look at how these returns and risk have been over the last 1, 5, 10, 25. We actually go up to 50, 75, and 80 years. And every year I calculate that as soon as I get the Ibbotson data, and I just haven't received that Ibbotson data for 2012 yet. And think about what percentage of your portfolio should be in bonds from your risk tolerance test. Okay. So, when I teach about investments, I teach investments differently. A lot of people take a financial assets approach. They'll talk about stocks and they'll talk about bonds and things like this. And I think that misses the point. Think, how long have ETFs been around? Someone define an exchange-traded fund. It's basically an index fund that trades on the stock market like a stock. But how long have ETFs been around? What, 4 or 5 years? How about index funds? How long have index funds been around? 10, 15 years? How about mutual funds? How long have those been around? My point here is if we take a fund approach, there's a lot of new instruments or assets that are coming around here. And ideally what we want to do is we want to take a principles-based approach, because the principles don't change even though the assets might. So really when we talk about teaching investments, we're really talking about 6 questions. And let me just share what each of those 6 questions are. What are financial markets? How do they operate? 2, what are asset classes and why are they important? 3, what are financial instruments and instruments and what are the advantages and disadvantages of each? 4, what's your asset allocation and how will it change over time? 5, what's your investment plan, your objective guidelines and constraints, and how will you invest? And 6, how will you build your portfolio? And how will you monitor it as well? So those are the questions over the next 5 days or 5 class periods we're going to talk about. Markets, instruments, asset allocation, investment policy statements, building and monitoring portfolios. So that's kind of the direction we're going. Question: are there things we should do before we invest? Yeah, had some students come in and says, I know I've got to invest. I know the time value of money. I got to put the money in right now, and so they take money out of their credit cards to invest in the stock market. Good idea or bad idea? Are there things we should do before we invest? Why don't we take 2 minutes in our groups and let's just talk about what are some of the things we should do before we invest. So why don't we share just a few ideas? I actually had someone over here tell me, gave me all the things that they needed, so probably don't need as much time. Give me one thing that we need to do before we start investing.
Obviously, you should pay off your really high interest rate debts, like you're talking about credit card debt.
So high interest rate debts. Do I have to pay off my house? How about my student loans? No, probably. No. Now, are both of those very low interest rate? Yeah. Okay. So pay off high interest rate credit card and consumer loans. Another thing. Yes.
You talked about being able to have an emergency fund first. Yeah. That way, you're not putting money into something that's not as easy to pull out of, and then you're in trouble with bills.
Right. So if you have trouble with bills, the last thing you want to do is sell long-term assets to cover short-term needs. And so you have an emergency fund. And what's the recommendation on that emergency fund? 3 to 6 months income. What does Dave Ramsey say? Like $1,000 first, and he says take it to $10,000 or something like that. Next thing. Know your goals. What else do we need? Oh, and besides goals, what do we need to be living on? Yeah, you need to be living on a budget. And I add, you need a well-written investment plan. And there's one other thing. Other thing that I think we need to talk about, and that's our bills. So is there a priority to paying bills? Which bills should we pay first? So let me start. I use what I call the investment hourglass. It's just a tool to help me teach. So let me start. The first question is, are your priorities in order, and are you square with the Lord? If you figure that it's all His, shouldn't we give back? Number 2, adequate health and life insurance. Should we be investing before we have, notice I say adequate health and adequate life insurance. Again, my cousin's daughter was 26, one child, and her husband passed away. They probably would have been a better investment to have life insurance there. Number 3, are you out of high interest rate credit card and consumer debt? And number 4, have you written down your personal goals? Do you live on a budget? And do you have a well-written investment plan? And that's over the next 5 days, we'll be working on these things. You know what? If you can answer these yes to all 4 of these questions, then I think you're ready to invest. Question, what does the top of the hourglass do? It teaches a few things. Any thoughts? What does it teach? Let me just share some ideas. It helps you keep your priorities in order. And what should those priorities be? Heavenly Father, our family, and personal responsibility. So it's priorities based. It's priorities based when we work here. Was it Einstein? He said this. He says, it's the height of insanity to do the same thing and get and get a different result. It's the height of insanity to do the same thing and get a different result. Someone else put it a different way, and they said, if you do what everyone else does, you'll get what everybody else gets. What do you think? Have most investors done well or done poorly in the equity markets or in the stock markets? What do you think? Better or worse?
Worse.
Why?
That chart right there. Taking into account the fees.
It takes into account the fees. Well, let me just take a little study. Let's see, make sure. 16, sorry. Anyone heard of a group called Dalbar? Dalbar puts out a book every year. It's called The Quantitative Analysis of Investor Behavior. They go out to a lot of these brokerage houses, they find the data. And they say, what's been the average return? In 2006, they took the data from 1986 to 2005. And they said, not is what the benchmark returns is, but what was the actual return for investors? And I'm not sure exactly how they do all of this. But over that time period, the investor returns in their study returned 3.9%. However, the benchmark was up 11.9%. Yes, those are annual returns over that 20-year period. Notice that there's 8% or 800 basis points difference. Why? And before you think that, okay, that's just an aberration, they did it in 2007, and I don't know how many years back they've done, and I'm just getting the returns. I'm waiting for 2013 numbers to come out. Now, the good news is the difference is dropping. The bad news, it's still negative. So most of these investors, they could have just bought an index fund and basically gotten that index return. So why? Why are our returns so poor? So if someone talked, maybe it's the fees, we're paying fees. Other reasons.
So I think a lot of times people get impatient, they don't invest for the long term, and so they buy something, it starts to go down, so they sell it because they don't want to go down.
They're not taking the long-term perspective. They're impatient. Other reasons. So they're buying and selling, they think they can time the market. How many people do you think can actually time the market? You know, I managed money for 13 years. At one point, we had $3.2 billion under management. We had a little bit of money under management. I can't time the market. So people think they can time the market. Other reasons. Well, maybe it's just for equities. What do you think bond investors? Do you think bond investors did any better? Notice here, still 560 basis points, 5.6%. How about people who do asset allocation, who allocate between stocks and bonds? Do they do any better? So what we get out of this here is an interesting thing, is what people do is not giving them the returns that they make, that they should have. At least they're not beating the benchmarks. And what can we do? Well, I guess the question is why? How can we do it to make sure that we don't have these type of returns? And the question is, has there been any guidance to help us in our investing? Austin, can I get you to read that for us?
We live in a complex society where even the simplest principles can be exquisitely difficult to apply. I admire investors who are determined not to obtain income or investment profits from transactions to add to the sum total of sin and misery in the world. But they will have difficulty finding investments that meet this high standard. Such complexities make it difficult to prescribe firm rules. We must rely on teaching correct principles, which each member should personally apply to govern his or her own circumstances.
So we must rely on teaching correct principles. So what I'd like you to do is let's go back into our groups. Let's spend 3 or 4 minutes and let's think, what should those correct principles be? One principle from our discussion, we should invest long term. We shouldn't put our money in and expect to take it out. We should put it in and leave it there. But let's spend a few minutes in our groups and let's just talk about what those principles should be. Okay.
A lot of times we get a lot of investor buyers and make sure that the trust that investors assume that there's also the whole your goals. Some they put all their money into their investments and they have nothing left over with their family to what others short-term goals have. When investing in a long-term goal, at least if you want to be a trader. You know what I mean? That's true. I like the last it's your turn. I like the person. I like being simple. But the principle makes sense. It's just like if you go in one place, I can figure out one place. I've never actually been stocks like I probably can. I guess that's what they do. The index funds always. They do it for you. Yeah.
Okay, what principles did we come up with? What principle, if we follow, will make us so we don't have the same type of returns as everybody else? So we'll be able to basically, well, let me ask a question. Is our purpose here just to get a high return? Or is our purpose here to invest so we can accomplish the goals, the personal and family goals that we have? Is investing a goal in itself, or is it a means to our other goals? And I think it's a means to our others. So what are some of the principles of successful investing? What did you come up with here?
We talked about the importance of that we're saving for goals rather than for having lots of money.
So, know your, basically know yourself, know your goals. Hopefully, can I add something here? Know your budget. You know how to spell.
Well, we talked about a story of this guy was asked by a state president, like, do you think that you should go serve, you and your wife should go serve a mission? Would like to recommend that to you. And he said that he couldn't because he was too busy actively managing his investments. Mm-hmm. And so, like, in that case, it's not about goals at that point. It's about getting as much money as possible.
Yeah. They shouldn't be that way.
We talked about educating yourself with the certain investment vehicles and finding those professionals that can help you who have reputable experience in the field.
So also finding, so basically work with good people / institutions. You know, and make sure that they have the proper licenses and they're qualified. Jacob.
Know the difference between investing and gambling?
You know what? And what is the difference between investing and gambling? So one is long term, one is short term. Where are the odds in your favor? The odds are in your favor here. They're not in your favor. Other things. Where's the creation of wealth? Creation, no creation. Which is part of a long-term plan? Long-term plan? No long-term plan. So realize that there is. Now, some people say, well, investing in single stocks is gambling. Possibly. But you know what? They haven't taken my 409, my modeling and valuation class, or my asset management class to know that the amount of work that we do before we sit down and put our first dollar into a stock. Okay, other? Yes?
The importance of diversification.
Yeah, be diversified. You know, diversification is your key defense against risk. Other ones? Yeah.
High return always come with high risk.
Yeah, high return, high risk. So that's probably understand yourself, understand the market, something like that. Let me just share a few that I've come up with that I think are important. And some of this is kind of fun. I've come up with what I call my 10 principles of successful investment. It includes the ones we've talked about. Number one, know yourself, your goals, your budget. You cannot spend your way into financial security. Yeah, who do you think you are, the government? You know your ability to tolerate risk, and then invest accordingly. When I was working, I did emerging markets for 13 years. And so I'd wake up one morning and there would be a coup in the Philippines. I'd wake up another morning and our money, we had $50 million in Malaysia that was stuck there because of foreign exchange controls. And so I learned that things could be pretty volatile. And so what I figured out is I liked a sleep well portfolio, that no matter what happened, I could sleep well at night. And that's kind of what I'd recommend for you, that a portfolio that you can sleep well and you're not worried about what's going up and down. But what you want to do, but you know that you can sleep well with the portfolio you have. Watch overconfidence. Who do you think trades more, men or women? That's right. Who do you think has the higher returns? The women. Who do you think trades more, single men or single women? Who has the higher return? Single women. I know. How about online trading? You know, the fact that you can go in and push a button and your trade immediately goes to the exchange, does that improve your ability to get returns? So does online trading improve your ability to get higher returns? Does it? Actually, no. What does it actually do? It encourages people to trade more and to churn the portfolio and runs up higher taxes and higher fees. Before online investors beat the market 1.9%, afterwards they underperformed by 3.6%. So all of these things are important. Understand risk. What's risk? My wife sometimes says risk is the threat of losing all our money. I had to tell her we've never lost all our money in any of the things we've invested in. But are there different means of risk? But there's lots of different risks out there. Different types of risk: inflation risk, business risk, interest rate risk, financial risk, political and economic risk. Do we have political risk in the United States? Yes. I used to think that political risk was only in these emerging markets countries. I'm finding we're in emerging market countries to a large degree. Exchange rate, call, liquidity risk. And the key is to invest at a risk level you're comfortable with. Now, as one of the things you need to do is we're going to need to take a risk tolerance test. And so let's talk a little bit about what a risk tolerance test is. A risk tolerance test is a test to help you understand what kind of an investor you are. How much risk are you willing to accomplish? So the thing is, you can go out on the internet and you can find all kinds of risk tolerance tests. I know I wrote some that we used at my previous company. But the purpose of those tests was first to help you to understand your risk and then try to encourage you to invest in our funds, our mutual funds here. But a risk tolerance test should help you to understand what kind of an investor you are. So and realize these are somewhat arbitrary. But I divide it into 5 areas. Just out of curiosity, if you had to divide what type of an investor you were into one of these 5 classifications, what would it be? Let's have everybody vote at once. Are you very conservative, moderate, aggressive, or very aggressive? And then we're going to take this risk tolerance test and we're going to see how you are. So how many people think you can only vote once. It's not like Chicago where you can vote early, vote often, and I'm just teasing. That's just, okay. Okay, very conservative. How many people think here you're very conservative? Raise your hands. 1, 2, 3. 3. How many people think that they're conservative? Would estimate 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Moderate? Aggressive? Very aggressive. Okay. So we'll just take that, we'll hold that. Now what I want to do is we are going to go through this risk tolerance test. It's Learning Tool 16. And so what it is, the purpose of the risk tolerance test is twofold. Number one, it's to help you to see what kind of an investor you are. Are you conservative? Are you moderate? And number two, it's to help you to come up with your first asset allocation target. So once we understand what type of an investor you are and we know what your age is, then we can come up with our preliminary asset allocation target. It used to be that people said, well, your asset allocation is your age in bonds. So I'm 58, so I would have 58% of my portfolio in bonds. Now, do you think all 58-year-old people have the same risk tolerance? Should they all have the same amount? So what factors would go into changing that amount? Yeah, what age you're going to retire? How about, do you have a defined benefit plan at work? Would that have an impact? Yeah. How about what kind of investor? Some 58-year-olds are a lot more aggressive. Some are a lot more conservative. And so what we do is we combine that. So your age in bonds is really a good starting point. And then we combine that with the results of this risk tolerance test. We'll say, OK, your age in bonds will make some certain adjustments there. So you could have a 58-year-old and a 48-year-old who have the exact same asset allocation. Whereas the 48-year-old maybe is aggressive and the 58-year-old is conservative. So let's go through here. So I'm going to ask you 8 questions. I want you to grab a pencil. What I want you to do is I want you to just circle, write the number beside the answer. So question number 1, what is your age? For most of you, it's going to be number 5, 24 and under. What's the impact of age on risk? So if you're younger, you have a longer time frame, and therefore you can take more risk. Time horizon. What's your investment time horizon for this money? And no, I wish I could give you all a pot of money and just, but let's assume you're all graduating too, so you're not going to spend it just to pay the bills. But let's say you had $5,000. What would be your time frame for this money? And so, 1 year, 2 to 5, 5 to 10, 10 to 20, 20 years or longer. What's the impact on time horizon for the money on your willingness to accept risk? Yeah, so if you've got a longer time horizon, can you take more or less risk? Probably take a little bit more. Number 3 is your investment goals. What is your primary objective for the money? Let me just explain those. Preservation as principle is you just don't want to lose money. Current income means that you would like some money to be coming in every month or every year. Growth in income means you'd like some money coming in, but you'd also like to see a little bit of growth in the balance as well. Conservative growth, you really don't need any current income coming in. You'd like it just to grow. We say conservative growth, and aggressive growth is you really like to shoot the lights out. You'd really like to get a high return on this. So what are your investment goals? So realize that that your budget, your goals and your budget seem to drive most areas of personal finance. Question number 4. So if you were conservative growth, you'd just put a circle over that 4, and we're just going to add those numbers up here. Personal earnings, regarding your current income, do you expect it to decrease dramatically, decrease, stay about the same, increase with inflation, or increase dramatically? Hopefully all of you has increased dramatically. But do you see the impact of that? If you expect your salary to decrease, what would that do to your willingness to tolerate risk? Yeah, probably you're probably less willing to tolerate risk. Number 5, there's only 8 questions. Your emergency fund. What amount of money do you have set aside for emergencies? None? 3 months expenses? 6 months expenses? What's the impact of an emergency fund on your ability to tolerate risk? If you have 3 to 6 month investment, do you think you're willing to take on more risk? Okay, do we all have these first 5? Only got 3 more. Investment experience. Which best describes your personal experience? I've never invested in any financial market or instrument, or all the way down. I've invested money for years and have a knowledge of how stock and financial markets work. What's the impact of investment experience? If you've got more experience, do you think you're willing to take on a little bit more risk? I think so too. Okay, now investment risk. Sometimes by seeing what you've done in the past, it can help you understand your ability to tolerate risk. So I'm comfortable investing in savings accounts, CDs, and other short financial instruments that are FDIC insured. You can kind of keep reading on those. Or I like to pick out new and emerging growth companies and aggressive growth stock mutual funds. And then our last one, investment preferences. Which of these would you prefer? Some of these returns are a little bit high. You could probably do 10, 8, 6, and 4, and 2. Change those numbers, but at least it'll give you an idea. So which investment would you more likely invest in? Investment has a 20-year average return of 4%. Infrequent and very slight downturns. It's never experienced negative returns. Or now it's got 6%, mostly positive, some periods of negative. 8%, few moderate periods down, few moderate periods up. 10%, high periods above average and several periods of negative. 12%. Okay, so now what I'd like you to do is add up the numbers here. Let's say on this one here you picked number 3, so you would circle that. Now I'd like you to add up the number from each of those. The number from each of those questions. And now we're gonna look. So remember we said that this risk tolerance test was a 2-part process. Number 1, to help you understand what kind of an investor you were. And number 2, to help you come up with your preliminary asset allocation. So anyone get 8 to 12 points? I'm going to So no one was very conservative. But now let's talk about that. So very conservative. But how would this change? Remember we talked, our goal was to come up with our asset allocation. So for a 25-year-old person, and let's say that person was very conservative, how much would they normally have, using this kind of that rule of thumb, how much would they have in bonds? 25%, their age in bonds. But now what we would do is we would make an adjustment here, if they were very conservative and 25 years old, notice that we would subtract 20% from stocks and add 20% to bonds and cash. And I include bonds and cash together. So what would their preferred asset allocation be for a very conservative 25-year-old? How much in equities? Probably 55%. How much in bonds and cash? 45, 45%. Do we see how that works? Okay, let's go on to the next group. Conservative, how many people were between 13 and 20 points? Raise your hand. Okay. So what this person would do, again, we'll say the same 25-year-old person, what they would do is they would add 10% to their bond allocation. So instead of 25% in bonds, they would add 10% there, and now they would be 35% in bonds. Your age in bonds is your starting point. How about moderate? How many people were moderate? 21 to 28 points. So for these people here, again, we start with their age in bond. The nice thing about moderate is you're just your age in bonds. So that's an easy allocation to work with. Anyone here aggressive? 29 to 36. Now these people here, notice what they do. They'd start with 25% in bonds, and so they'd probably cut that down. They'd be about 10% in bonds. How about anyone else very aggressive? 37 to 40. What? Okay, and so in Jordan's case, at 25, he would basically have 5% in bonds and 95% in equities. But the nice thing about what this does, this actually shows us that we can be the same age as someone else, but because of our willingness to tolerate risk, we can either take on more risk or we can take on less risk. What do you do with a spouse? If you're married, what should your allocation be? In my case, I was very aggressive. My wife was very conservative. So when we moved back here to BYU, we actually took a moderate stance. And it really saved us a lot of money because in 2003, the markets really didn't do too well. And so as a family, you come up with views that are consistent for both of you. So let's continue with where we were. So understand risk. Stay diversified. Diversification is really your primary goal against changes in the market. I heard someone say, well, it's called the lost decade. It says over the last 10 years, the S&P hasn't, it's basically where it was 10 years ago, and this was last year. And I said, that wasn't the case for me. He says, I didn't just invest in a single asset class. I wasn't just in equities. I was in large cap equities, and I was in small cap equities, and I was in mid cap, and I was in international, and I was in emerging markets. I was in intermediate bonds, and I was in short-term bonds, and I was in inflation-protected securities, and I was in junk bonds. And the point here is if we're diversified, we have a much greater chance of accomplishing our goals. Low cost and tax efficiently. We need to make sure, every dollar that you spend on paying fees and expenses is $1 less that you could use towards your goals. If you buy a load mutual fund, you're paying of every dollar, you're paying 5.5 cents to the salesman for the privilege of selling you that fund. Does that make sense? If you have a fund with a 12B1 fee, you are paying the mutual fund for the privilege of them marketing that fund to others. Does that make sense? If you pick a fund that buys and sells a whole bunch, guess what? You're going to pay a lot of taxes you're going to pay a lot of taxes because every time the fund sells a security, it's a taxable event. So you need to be wise in what you do and realize that frequent trading incurs significant costs, both in terms of transaction costs and fees. So you pick your fund, you're actually picking the expenses you're paying as well. Here's just a couple of funds. You know what they are is just representative large equity funds. So realize it's not just, most of us only hear this expense ratio. This is, oh, that's what we pay the fund to invest. But realize you can actually go through and find out what the brokerage commissions were for the fund. And more importantly, this estimated implicit trading costs can be significantly higher. So you buy a fund that trades a whole bunch, this is going to be here. And you know what? And I invest in a bunch of index funds. And guess what I'm paying on my index funds? This fund here, basically you have to make 1% before you make any money. Some of these index funds I'm paying like 17 basis points. So I'm way down here. This fund only has to make 17 basis points, 0.17% for me to make any money. So be wise in what you do. Defer or eliminate taxes as much as possible. So what you want to do, if you can put money into a qualified retirement plan, you don't pay any taxes until you take it out at retirement. If you can buy funds that don't do a lot of distribution, they don't do a lot of buying and selling, you can reduce the taxes that you pay each year. Realize it's not what you make, but what you make after taxes and inflation that really makes you wealthy. Invest long term. You know what? This short term stuff and day trading is really, you need to be wise. I had some friend come to me and said, you know what, I'm thinking about doing day trading to make some extra money. And I said, good luck. I said, it's a way to make a small fortune. But you have to start with a big fortune first. But day trading is not an investment strategy. It's not a long-term one. This is Barber and O'D, and they say trading is hazardous to your wealth. They actually went into a brokerage house, got permission, and they looked at, notice these numbers are here. This is from the early 2000s. But this is their gross return, this is their net return, and this is their monthly turnover rate. So the way you calculate how often you turn the portfolio over, if you take 100 divided by your turnover rate, then it tells you on average how long do you hold each of the securities in their portfolio. So if I take monthly turnover rate here, 0.2, I'm going to multiply it by 12 to give me my annual turnover rate. So I get 2.4. Let's say 2.5 to make it easy. What's 100 divided by 2.5? 40. So on average, how many years did these people hold this portfolio? 40 years. Each of them. So notice their gross return and their net return here, really high. Now these people here, 1.2 times 12, let's say 15% annual turnover. So on average, how long did these guys hold these portfolios, the assets in their portfolio? 100 divided by 15, what, 6? So on average, about 6 years. Now notice that the returns dropped. Trade more, the returns dropped. Now this group here, 2.9 times 12, let's just say 33% on average. How many years did they hold their stocks in the portfolio? 100 divided by 33, 3 years. Notice the return. This group here, 6 times 12, so this is a monthly turnover rate, times 12, 72. So on average, how long did they hold the stocks in their portfolio? Yeah, a year and a couple of months. And notice this one here, 21.5 times 12, 240. On average, how long did they hold them? 3 months. Now notice this black return is our net return. Notice the more trading, the lower the return. Also, one thing that this doesn't take into account, what's the impact of trading on taxes? Assuming these are taxable accounts, your net return is probably pretty close to your taxable return. This one here, maybe you're 17.6, maybe down to 16. This one here, maybe your 16.8 is down to about 14. Maybe your 15 is down to about 11. Your 11 is probably down to about 6. So everything here is taxed at your ordinary rate. And so this one here is probably down to about 5 or 6%. So realize, the more you trade, the more taxes, and generally, the research has shown the lower the returns. Yes?
So where do we access the information that will tell us how frequently mutual funds?
We'll use Morningstar, and we'll get to that. So today what I'm trying to do, the first 2 or 3 days, I'm trying to build the foundation. And then we'll get into actually selecting mutual funds and using a database to find that information. Number 4, if you must invest in individual assets, know what you invest in and who you invest in. I had a student ask if he could talk to me after class. And I said, sure. And then I walked out and he came to me, and then I noticed his spouse came from the other side. Whenever I've got a, husband and wife together, then I knew there was some concerns. And they told me, they said, you know what, this guy was in my congregation, and he was telling us of all these good returns he was getting on his money. And so he asked us if we wanted him to manage his money, our money for him, and we said sure. And actually they said, we asked him if he would manage. And so for the first couple of months he did well. And then pretty soon the market turned. He was using options and futures, and the markets turned against him, and he basically lost it all. And they came to me and said, well, what can we do? And I said, you know what, he's not registered, he's not licensed, there's nothing you can do. And so make sure, know what you're investing, know who you're investing with, be aware of the environment. I would venture to say even most finance students, really don't have the tools to help them to really invest. I don't think you need to take some of these really specialized classes. I don't think it's taken something like the modeling evaluation class in the finance department, the 409 class, or the 415 class, which is an asset management class that you actually learn the skills to really make good individual decisions. What we talk about in this class is not sufficient to allow you to go out and buy individual stocks. Monitor performance. I like President Monson said this, where performance is measured, performance improves. Where performance is measured and reported, the rate of improvement accelerates. What was he talking about? Any ideas? He's actually talking about home teaching. But is that true? Yeah. And my wife used to tell me, she said, just, you manage the money. And I thought it was pretty good, and I thought I was doing okay. And then we later decided that, once a year I need to report on performance. And I started doing that, and she says, you know what, these funds that you have, they're underperforming the benchmarks. Why are we still in them? So finally we sold them out and bought index funds, and we've had much better performance since then. So how do you know how you're doing unless you check performance against benchmarks? I have another good friend who works with one of these large brokerage house, and I says, well, how'd you do last year? And he said, well, I did fine. I go, what kind of return do you get? He didn't know. What's your benchmark? He didn't know that either. How do you know how you're doing unless you're performing, unless you're comparing it to a benchmark? And so it's really critical that we do that. Number 8, principle 8, don't waste too much time trying to beat the market. Time, money, and energy trying to beat the market unless you have a lot of time, money, and energy. Most of you are not going to be portfolio managers. That's not what we're training for you in the class. You're going to be good accountants and corporate finance people and managers and bosses and things like that. So key is, what can we do? Can we build a sleep well portfolio and still get the returns? And I'm not saying that you don't invest in actively managed funds. You might want to do it for a while. But compare that performance to benchmarks. And if they underperform, then go to an index funds. Efficient, inexpensive, tax efficient, and valuable alternatives. 9, high quality, licensed, and reputable people and institutions. When you need help, get the help you need. But get good help from good people. Now, how many think of these institutions are going to be interested in you once you start off from school? Probably none, because your asset size is going to be small. Most people won't be interested in having you as a client probably till you have $500,000 to $1 million in assets. And what we're going to teach you in this class will take you to that $1 million level and beyond. And then the last one, develop a good investment plan consistent with these principles, your goals, budget, and follow it closely. This is going to be your roadmap to investing success. If you write it wisely and if you follow it, it will save you a lot of heartache in the future, and it'll probably help you as you accomplish your personal goals. So, let's just take a look at how asset classes have done in the past. So, why do we study the history of asset class? So someone want to define an asset class for me. What is an asset class? Give me an example of an asset class.
Large cap.
Large cap stocks. Give me some other examples. Emerging markets, emerging market stocks. And you could actually have emerging market stocks. You could have emerging market bonds. So these are asset classes: large cap, small cap, international, emerging markets. Bonds, you could have short-term bonds. You could have short-term governments. You could have short-term corporates. You could have intermediate term. You could have long-term. You could have junk. But an asset class is a group of stocks that have similar characteristics. It could be market capitalization. It could be duration on the instrument, things like that. But what I'd like to do is just give you some views. Again, this is from 1925 to 2011. And notice, this is small cap. This is large cap. This is corporates. This is long-term governments. This is short-term. And this is inflation. So if you had started with $1 in 1925, if it would all been invested in large caps, you'd have 15,500. Excuse me, small caps. Large caps, you'd have 3,000. Long-term government bonds, 119.21. So you can actually see this. So how have the odds been when you invest in the stock markets? Is there generally a long-term positive return? Yeah. Sometimes when we take a longer view, let's look at 1987. Big drop, huh? When you take this. So if we take a longer term view, I think it's more important. Let's take a look at historical risk and returns. So small cap, higher returns over this time period. What do you guys think going forward? Do you think equity markets are going to deliver more returns, higher returns, or lower returns that they have in the past? Is government regulation increasing or decreasing? Decreasing. Is that going to make it harder for firms to continue to deliver? Are taxes increasing or decreasing? Increasing. Is it going to make it, are people going to be willing to take on those increased risks? Notice 1-year returns since 1926. Does that seem pretty volatile? Why would you ever want to invest in something like that? Okay, so let's take a 5-year returns. Does that look a little bit better? How about 10-year returns? And we haven't even added returns in 2012. What was the S&P returns in 2012? Is it about 16%? Something like that. So what we've done here is just asset class returns. So S&P 500, 1 year. In fact, 2012, it was 60%. 5 years, 10 years, 25. What do you notice about this chart? And then I added international, and we only have 25 years here. In emerging markets, we have 10. But what do you notice about this chart? What do you notice about as you take a longer perspective? If you take a longer term view, do the returns? Do the returns do better? Is there volatility in the short term? Yeah. But as you take a longer term view, the perspective is better. So again, just some lesson learned. Is there a positive relationship between risk and return? And volatile on a monthly basis or annual basis, generally more likely you'll have positive returns. So let's do a couple of case studies. And let's just see what we can come up with. Ryan's 35 years, took the risk tolerance test from the learning tools. He determined he was moderate in terms. So based on the rule, his age in bonds and the results from the risk tolerance test, which of the following allocations most likely represents Ryan's preferred asset allocation? So I include emergency fund included in his cash and bonds. So what do you think? Because each of you are going to have to come up with your preliminary asset allocation. So he's 35 years old. He's moderate. How much should he have in bonds and cash? 35%. So what about A? Is that for a moderate? Is that a moderate investor? That'd probably be very conservative. How about B? What kind of investor would be B? Probably aggressive. How about C? Yeah, that'd probably be Ryan's case. Because we add the cash and the bonds together, that's 35%. And generally what we'll do, that's 35% here. So he's moderate. So having a large allocation to equities, large caps, is that risky or not risky? Let me just give you, let's give you some asset classes. Which is the least risky of the assets? Least. Where would you put large cap here? Is it your least risky or is it more risky? Probably least. How about, what would you do? We'll start with large cap as the least risky. What's the next one for taking on more risk? We're talking about equities. What would be more risky than large cap? Probably mid cap. And the way they define that is generally large cap is something greater than 10 billion. Mid cap is 2 to 10 billion, and then small cap. What would be next? Small. How about next? Probably international. And then below that, emerging market. And you know what? These three could be really close together, and I'm not sure exactly. How about if you do bonds? Which are the least risky? So probably government, probably short-term government. What would give you a little bit more risk? Yeah, so intermediate government. Then you've got corporates. And you could also put inflation protected, things like tips, things like there. And then you get down here to junk. But realize there's lots of different areas. And once we use our asset allocation to determine our allocation to stocks and bonds, then we can allocate within these asset classes whether we want to take on more risk or less risk. Yes? Jared?
So it's important to diversify.
Uh-huh. Okay. So how do you diversify when you don't have a lot of money? So if you buy an index fund, do you have to buy 12 different assets to get diversification? Or can you have diversification with a single fund? And I think you can have diversification with a single fund. What you want to do is you want to look at. You could buy a S&P 500. Well, one of my favorite stocks is an international index fund. It's basically, it's got like 7,000 stocks in it. And you know what? Am I diversified when I've got 7,000 stocks in it? Yeah, I am. And you could buy a total market index fund here in the U.S. and they have like 5,000 stocks in it too. So you can get diversification with a single fund. Now, could we buy a mutual fund that also has bonds and equities in it? You can. There are things that are called target date funds too. They give you an allocation 60-40 on things like 60-40 allocation, 60% equities, 40% bonds. Now, what we're going to be doing in this class, because your goal is you're going to save between 10 and 20% of every dollar you make after college, probably better for you to buy individual asset class funds instead of having funds that are mixtures, because that way you'll be able to continue. And we'll talk about this a little bit more. Let's do one more. So let's continue this here. Now, same Ryan, same age. Now he's aggressive in terms of risk. Using the same rule of thumb, which portfolio most likely represents Ryan's asset allocation? What kind of investor is A? Yeah. Either conservative or very conservative. B. Now he's 35 years old. So would B be Ryan's? Yeah, probably B would be it. C would be moderate, and D would be, yeah, very aggressive. And then the question is, what would his results be if he was very aggressive? Probably D. But did you get a sense? So each of you are going to have to determine what is your preliminary asset allocation. We've taken this risk tolerance test. Let's say you were moderate. Let's say you're 25 and you're moderate. Moderate's the easy one because it's basically your age in bonds. So your preliminary asset allocation would be 25% in bonds, 75% in equities. Now some people would say, well, that's pretty aggressive. Well, maybe so, but you've got a long time until you retire. The risk is if you invest too conservatively, when you get to be my age, you may find that you don't have the returns that you needed. And so I actually like the chart that we had here, what people thought and what we actually were from the risk tolerance test. Sorry. I liked what we thought. We thought we're probably a little bit. We basically, the target shifted down just a little bit. We're a little bit more aggressive. And it's important, again, if we have our emergency fund, if we're comfortable with our education and things like that, we can be willing to take on a little bit more risk. Okay, questions? So again, we're working on the investing side. Again, be patient with me. These first 3 class periods, we're going to be building the foundation. And then, but like I said, by the time we're done, we want you to feel comfortable that you're going to know what to invest in. You're going to actually know the mutual funds. You're going to know what your asset allocation. You'll know your investment policy statement. And you'll feel a lot more comfortable with this. Thanks, everyone.